Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Shama Sawant.
And I'm Bia Lacombe. There is a profound crisis in public education in the United States. It's been building for decades with repeated savage cuts to already threadbare funding. The crisis has become much more acute since the COVID pandemic hit in 2020, both for students and educators and other public school workers. Students in poor and working class districts are disproportionately affected by far. There's a massive shortage of educators across the country and a shortage of substitutes to fill in for them. A combination of immense stress from teaching through the pandemic, increased violence and school shootings, and drastically low pay has pushed many educators to leave the profession altogether.
I think one of the obvious reasons subs are walking away from the job is compensation. It's not a living wage job. And I think this might even be more significant is the lack of support.
You can't take from teachers and give so little back to them and then expect people to continue to stay. It's just not realistic.
The pandemic, I'd say that as one of my last reasons because it only exacerbated all the inequities that were already there.
On average, teachers made 26.4% less than other similarly educated professionals in 2022, the lowest level since 1960. Many educators are forced to work 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. Even before the pandemic, teachers reported being twice as stressed as adults in other professions did. The crisis in school funding and attacks on public sector unions underlie all of this. For decades, politicians at the state and federal levels have starved public schools of necessary funding. School buildings across the U.S. are falling apart and in need of major repairs.
So this is a floor that's actually collapsing. Look along the wall. You can see it's dropped 2, maybe even 3 inches. This, folks, is an actual lab for high school students. People attend lab in this classroom. Why can't the school district do better?
Because we don't have enough money for it.
Educators are buying school supplies with their own money. Class sizes have increased dramatically in school districts across the country, negatively affecting student outcomes and increasing educator workload and exhaustion to unsustainable levels. During the pandemic, the Biden administration included over $120 billion in the American Rescue Plan to help schools reopen. But that one-time funding, while extremely necessary, simply does not address the deep and long-standing crisis in public education funding.
If you look at a teacher and you say to them, we want you to be a therapist, we want you to be a social worker, we want you to be a teacher, obviously, we want you to have some safety training, and then you layer in the joys of the pandemic and learning to teach online and to teach remotely. But don't forget that we do have the joy of standardized testing that we're going to layer on top of that, and then we're going to evaluate how you're successfully navigating all of the challenges facing the world while you're teaching a kid to read.
Underfunding schools and attacks on educators and other public school unions has been a bipartisan policy by both the Republican and the Democratic parties. These attacks disproportionately affect Black and other oppressed communities. Republicans and the right wing openly proclaim their plans to dismantle and privatize the U.S. public education system. But Democrats are no less hostile to our schools, even if some of them use more progressive rhetoric. For example, here in Washington state, the state Supreme Court found the Democrat-run state legislature criminally guilty of underfunding public education for decades. These politicians cite budget shortages and lack of revenue, cutting teacher pay and closing schools entirely while cutting taxes on the rich. Taxing wealthy corporations and billionaires, meanwhile, would raise the money necessary to fix many of these urgent issues. The crisis in education is only deepening, but inspiring struggles of unionized educators across the country have shown that there is a way forward if we have the right strategies and tactics to win. It's important that we draw out the lessons of these struggles because they apply not just to educators, but workers everywhere looking to fight back. We're very excited to have Joe Segru with us today to talk about these lessons. Joe is a K-12 music teacher, a member of Workers Strike Back, and a member of the North Shore Education Association here in the Seattle area, which is affiliated with the National Education Association.
Before we get started, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel and become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement and that On Strike can continue to bring you coverage of a wide range of issues from a working class perspective you won't find on mainstream media. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people.
you're not alone, right? You're not just sitting on your couch, doom scrolling, reading all these different terrible news stories alone, that there are thousands and in reality millions of working class people who feel just as frustrated and also want to see a path forward, who know that higher wages, high quality healthcare, and high quality housing are totally possible.
We're building on the example of the past decade in Seattle on a national scale to widen and strengthen the class struggle. Who here wants to be a part of that movement?
Go to workerstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Let's start our conversation now about the crisis in public schools and what working people can do to address it. So welcome to On Strike, Joe.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us what it's like to be an educator right now, especially in the context of the catastrophic underfunding of public schools?
Absolutely. From the onset, I would also like to say that I absolutely love teaching. I love teaching music. I love creating music with my students and with my coworkers. And I can say that essentially all of my coworkers I've ever worked with, whether teaching music or other subjects, feel the same. And so a lot of this is challenging to talk about, but it's necessary in order to fight for public education that teachers deserve, all school staff deserve, and really our students deserve as well. As far as what it's been like, I think you mentioned so much of this in the intro, but just the low wages that teachers are experiencing in relation to inflation has been extremely difficult. Also, larger class sizes, programs being cut like special education, English as a second language, the arts, like my own program, which maybe we'll talk about later on. This is all really difficult. Another massive crisis that was alluded to as well is the turnover that's happening in public education. NEA has had a number of surveys over the last few years that show teachers are quitting the profession at a much earlier time than they had anticipated, are retiring early, or less and less people are actually joining the public education workforce from the beginning. So this is a huge crisis. One thing that is so important too in the context of all of this is that the budget cuts are oftentimes talked about like an inevitability. You read about them in the news as if it's the only thing that we have to deal with it, right? And instead, those decisions we have to acknowledge, they're being made by Democratic Party and Republican Party politicians. And when workers organize and fight back, we can change that. So then the second part of the question, right? So why is this happening? I think one of the main reasons is for decades, businesses, politicians, the establishment have been attacking labor unions. And we know this, but they haven't made as many deep cuts into public sector unions and educator unions. And they want to just continue that. They want to not continue that. They want to go after them, actually. And so it's a question of control. It's a question of going after the labor unions. And there's also a profit motive involved as well. If public education is defunded, then that money can go towards, private schools and charter schools that have a profit incentive also.
So this crisis has been hitting your school district too, right, Joe? Can you tell us, what's been going on with your recent contract and how did your union respond in that situation?
So in August of this past school year, we ratified a new contract, and the district bargained with the union leadership and the bargaining team the previous spring and summer to come up with that contract. So then we voted on it in August, right before our school year, and then that was supposed to be the terms that we would work with for the next, I believe, 2 years. It might have been a 3-year contract. But only 2 months later, in October, the union leadership let us know that the district came back to them and demanded that they reopen the contract because of a $6 million budget shortfall that hadn't been accounted for during those budget negotiations, which, it seemed like to me like the district actually knew about that and they bargained in bad faith. I guess I don't know if I have the proof for that or anything. Regardless, it's not an okay thing for us to be reopening our contract. Maybe it's not the time to go into all the details of all this, but I felt like a very rushed process actually happened with members getting an email survey to see if they wanted to reopen the contract or not. And a false choice, I think, was presented between we either reopen the contract or we accept even more vicious cuts, as opposed to what I think we should do, and we can continue talking about, in that we should instead go on the offensive to tax the rich and fully fund public education to make up for those budget shortfalls. In short, that was still kind of pushed through the membership, and the union leadership and the bargaining team renegotiated with the district.
I mean, that's a pretty scandalous thing, right? For the union leadership to say, like, we are just going to accept that the district is telling us they don't have the money to fulfill the contract that we originally bargained, and so we're just going to, without fighting back at all, accept more cuts. So yeah, you were pointing to the need to tax the rich to really change this situation. So what did you, do in response to this, and other union members, how did they respond to this whole situation?
Sure. So right when we heard about that, actually, myself and another worker strike back activist and other coworkers of ours were extremely upset and organized against this reopening. And we called for a general membership meeting so that workers could discuss those kinds of alternatives and could talk about how we don't want to accept this false choice and look to other strikes and things like that to show how we can be on the offensive.
So, you were talking about how you and other workers strike back activists and other, if your co-workers and fellow union members tried to push back against the union leadership's approach of really essentially forcing the educators take the burden of the district needing to rebalance its budget. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of strategy you presented? I think you talked to your fellow union members about what can actually be done and how you can fight back.
Yeah, absolutely. At the onset of us learning about this reopening or the threat of reopening, we called for a general membership meeting to discuss alternatives and exactly like you're talking about, a strategy so that we don't just have to accept that false choice between, some cuts in a new contract, even though we just ratified another one 2 months ago.
Am I right that actually the false choice was that there were going to be cuts no matter what?
Yeah.
It's just a question of how many cuts.
Yes. That's always been, even since the beginning of bargaining for the original contract ratified in August, the framing and the narrative from the union leadership, unfortunately, and we don't want that, but that is the case, has always been, we will have to accept some sort of cuts. You can choose which cuts. And I just think that's not acceptable. So as far as a strategy is concerned, we talked about initially the need to build for a massive rally outside of Olympia to put pressure on the state legislature to fully fund public education. And in the state of Washington alone, although I'm sure this is similar in other states as well, we have Amazon, which has made record profits since the pandemic. Microsoft, record profits since the pandemic. I think their last Q4 of 2023 was their biggest profit that they've ever had, that they've reported. So it's just completely unacceptable to think that we as educators, students, workers have to pay for a crisis we didn't create, especially when the budget shortfall is only a few $1 million. And these people make a few $1 million in a matter of, minutes, seconds. So we needed to put pressure on the state legislature in Olympia to tax the rich to fully fund public education. That would have required a rally. It would require door knocking and community canvassing to get everybody else involved. It would require fundraising for strike funds. But none of this is unprecedented, really. It's just a matter of, looking to other struggles that have been waged and putting forward that strategy instead of accepting these false choices. And I mentioned the reopening of the contract just to explain, because sometimes this stuff gets a bit jargony. Essentially, we decided as a union that this was the contract in August and we voted on it. And it should have been that way. Those were our working conditions. Those were our school conditions for those 2 or 3 years. And reopening it was literally just saying, nope, we're going back to the bargaining table. We're still working on that basis, on that contract, but there will be a new contract in 2 months' time or in 3 months' time, as opposed to in 2 or 3 years' time, which is a bad precedent to set. That's,
And especially because they were talking about reopening the contract to make you guys swallow cuts.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. They couldn't hold up their end of the bargain. Mm-hmm. And instead of them problem solving, which still would probably mean taxing the rich, but of course they're not going to be the ones to put that forward. They don't want to take up that fight. So they put it on us. And instead of us taking up the fight, unfortunately, the union leadership said, we have to accept these cuts. We have to accept a new contract.
And what did the cuts actually look like in terms of what you were all asked to vote on?
Absolutely. It's really unfortunate. So essentially just now a few weeks ago in early February, the union leadership and the bargaining team held a general membership meeting to present us with this new contract. And again, myself, other worker strike back activists, other coworkers, we thought that we should have had general membership meetings far before this to talk about the whole situation. But in that contract they put forward, they said that, for example, there's a lot of details in it, but some of the highlights, the really brutal highlights, are that the contract included 63 positions cut that they wanted us to vote on yes. And the alternative, they said, the district would then instead cut 182 positions. And it gets really messy too, but one of those 63 positions was also one of mine, which is a 5th grade instrumental music program, which they just totally cut, just removing all of those teachers. They also cut 8th grade kindergarten paraprofessionals. It's really bad. Another thing that they'll do, just to say on this false choice, is they pit workers against each other with these false choices. In the tentative agreement that we voted on, there was the 5th grade instrumental, the kindergarten paras, those were on the chopping block. In the district version, if we hadn't have ratified the TA, they would have gotten rid of all of the deans, or 11 deans in the district. And people want deans in the district because there's a lot of, behavioral challenges that deans play a really important and restorative role, right?
It's a classic divide and conquer.
It's divide and conquer. So people say, well, we'd rather have the deans in 5th grade music. Whereas myself and other workers' strike back activists were saying, no, we want all of that. And actually we want more. So that's the reality of that. So unfortunately, that was ratified. And I think it's because the union leadership didn't put forward an alternative to accepting these cuts. They didn't put forward a fighting strategy. What we did as rank and file members was we went to the meeting with a leaflet explaining all of these ideas and explaining what a strategy would look like and saying it's not too late for us to take this up. But we have to get organized. And we distributed that leaflet to our coworkers, and we had some really good conversations. And even if a few people disagreed with us, that's fine. It's important to just have these conversations in the workplace instead of just, moving along with the status quo and accepting this criminally defunded public education system. On this leaflet, it even said educators and students didn't create this crisis. We shouldn't have to pay for it. We explained that it was a false choice. And then on the back of the leaflet was more in-depth information on a strategy, on the fighting strategy that I was talking about earlier, and how our union should take it up. And also if people want to get more involved, to get in touch with us and just trying to start that conversation. And another thing on that leaflet too was it talked about how we can win taxing the rich to fully fund public education, and how that was done in Seattle, where we won the Amazon tax through a movement. It didn't all go to public education. It was primarily towards affordable housing, which is absolutely related and we should be fighting for as well. But it shows that when we fight, we can win, right? And the last thing too is that I think that workers are hungry to fight and are really tired of this argument that comes from the establishment, from Democratic Party and Republican Party politicians alike, even unfortunately from some union leaderships, that we have to accept cuts. We have to accept cuts. We have to take the lesser of two evils. Whatever it is, at a certain point, we have to fight back, because it's just a death spiral, really.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you and other, educators were talking about the fact that you didn't need to accept this and that there is a fight back that's possible, even though the contract did get reopened and then the new contract with cuts was passed. Even though that happened, I think now, there are more educators in the union who know that there are some people who are trying to get organized to fight back, and they see a potential that, that can happen in the future, even though it wasn't, necessarily the case with this specific fight. But I think that was so crucial to lay the basis for that. But I wanted to ask, because, another really important aspect of all of this is compensation and how much teachers are paid. Educators it's well known that they're incredibly poorly compensated, many working multiple jobs to make ends meet, and having to live far away from where they teach. And so I think, one thing is that we've seen, I think, pretty frequently when educators go out on strike to fight for better wages is the attack from mainstream media and the establishment that they're being quote unquote greedy, and that they're asking for too much, and that they're putting, teachers or they're putting students and the community in a bind in order to, get themselves more money. This, I think, has led some unions to take the approach of de-emphasizing wage demands, or even apologizing for having them, or settling for less than what members need. And so I'm wondering what you think about that approach. Do you believe that educators need sustainable standards of living and decent working conditions? And how do you explain that need to other people?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question to ask, because we really do hear that in the mainstream media a lot, and other forces that are, again, trying to attack these unions, attack public education as an institution. One thing is that, again, there is so much wealth in our society at the top, so much wealth, that we should not accept any worker has wages that are not, giving them a great standard of living. That's just, yeah, I think that's just that. But as far as education specifically, it's a race to the bottom argument. If we continue to accept that, then everything is just going to get increasingly worse, not just for educators, but another important point is it gets worse for our students too. And our working conditions are also their learning conditions. And that's been something that's brought up in struggle and is an important argument against that as well.
Right. And not separate from all these crises that we're talking about that directly affect educators, but then indirectly affect the futures of students, is what's happening with students themselves. We know that there are staggering figures about young people's mental health crisis. And in fact, a CDC survey recently showed that over 44% of teenagers had experienced persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. And almost 20%, which is 1 in 5 American teenagers, have considered suicide. I mean, these are just stunning numbers. And according to these numbers, in any given high school classroom, 2 or 3 students will have attempted suicide, and several more would have considered it. In Seattle, high school students and counselors, as you know, and as some of our viewers might know, we fought alongside our Socialist City Council office at the time. This was late last year, and our People's Budget campaign to win $20 million in the city budget to fund mental health counselors for students. And, this is, as we know, it's $20 million added to the Amazon tax that you were mentioning that we won in 2020. And so I was wondering if you can talk about this victory that we won, the $20 million. What lessons can we take home from this? And do you think that applies just for Seattle? Is something unique about Seattle? Or this is something that who is watching this from any other state in the United States can also learn from?
This is all so crucial. And again, I'm glad we're talking about it, not because it's happy stuff, but because we love our students. We care about their mental health tremendously, as do the people who live with them and the community as a whole. And it is an unfortunate situation to be talking about, but it has to be addressed, and I think addressed politically. As far as some of the things that you're describing too, I have seen this, but I know from talking to other coworkers, from teachers all across the country, from all kinds of media and so on, that anxiety, stress, eating disorders, all of these things that you're describing are increasingly, putting stress on students and educators as a whole. I think that this is also oftentimes it's disproportionately affecting already marginalized communities like, Black students, LGBTQ students, and it's not acceptable. And one last point on mental health resources, and then I do want to talk a lot actually about the victory in Seattle, because it's inspiring, and it's not just inspiring, but it's politically extremely important to draw those lessons. One last thing as well is that with capitalism, not just going after public education, but also mental health resources outside of school, it's important that we have professionally trained school counselors in school to be a first line of defense and help students as well. And having teachers do professional developments and trainings on, being the first people to identify things is important, but it's not enough. Like, we need professional counselors in schools, in every school full time. That's what's needed. As far as the lessons in Seattle, they're incredible. I mean, we were talking about I think a $6 million budget shortfall for the North Shore School District, and that created this whole reopening and these false choices and all that. But in Seattle, we won $20 million. What is that? 3 something times 6? Yeah. We won $20 million for just school counseling. That's absolutely necessary. And it was done, and I know because also I live in Seattle and have been a part of this as well, by putting pressure on the Democrats of the city council to vote yes. And it's so important that they said there's no money. Whenever anyone says there's no money to fund this, there's no money to fund that, they are lying. There is money. You just have to fight for it. And it means taking up, battles with the rich and so on.
And it just shows that movements and organizing of students, and if we stand united in solidarity with each other from the north end of Seattle to the south end of Seattle, we can win big changes for the entire Seattle schools.
That's a lesson actually we brought out in that contract ratification meeting. We talked about the $20 million in Seattle. We pointed to other strikes as well and said, this is possible. It just takes a different approach than accepting any false choices.
And I remember, I think it was so inspiring to see so many high school students show up to these budget public hearings with signs that they had made saying, like, you're choosing between, taxing the wealthiest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, or students having like the basic mental health care that we need.
And the Democratic council member was so annoyed that the students were there. And yeah, it really shows an example of how we used our office.
Yeah, absolutely. In our office, organizing with these students and with the mental health counselors to show up and really reiterating that the only way we've ever won anything is by mobilizing as many people to these hearings, to the city council as possible.
On the question you asked about, is this unique to Seattle, that $20 million was won for school counseling? I absolutely don't think so. I think that it's a question of strategy, and this strategy really can be used everywhere.
As many of our viewers know, Shama was a socialist city council member in Seattle for a decade, and we used that office to fight for so many things: the Amazon tax, renters' rights, the $15 minimum wage. We were fighting with these people's budget movements against this very thing we've been talking about, which is that there's no money for the things that working people need when it comes down to it, but there's always money for the rich and the powerful, for big business and the establishment. But we're always told, working people have to suck it up and take, cut after cut. And so we were fighting against that very notion, successfully did win, hundreds of millions of dollars for, programs for, renters who are facing eviction, for various like community organizations that do renter outreach or that do outreach in the, the Vietnamese seniors community.
Yeah, and to build new affordable housing.
Absolutely.
Which is almost unheard of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just to add, even in the last few months, I've had to move because of rent increases, which obviously we have been fighting against in Seattle. We've been fighting for rent control and all that. The only way I was able to move was because of the victory that we won with the council office years ago of renters being allowed to pay for move-in fees, so their last month's rent, deposits, things like that, in equal monthly installments up to 6 months. So, for example, a lot of renters have to pay these landlord move-in fees of $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 across the country. Totally unacceptable. But because of our council office and the movement, that won these laws through the council office, through the People's Budget Campaign, now we had a move-in fee of $1,500, for example, and we got to pay it in 5 equal monthly installments of $300 a month, which is still a lot of money, but it makes it a lot more manageable. And in addition to that, the same law put a cap on move-in fees as well, which is extremely important. While we're talking about it, just wanted to point that out. And if anyone is living in Seattle and listening, they should use that because it's very easy to forget about unless we're all talking about it.
So a recent strike happened in Newton, Massachusetts that you've probably heard about. Educators went on a 2-week strike for better pay, benefits, and for more social workers in schools, which ties into this whole theme we're talking about, the need to have mental health support in schools for students. The union really successfully mobilized members to picket lines, held regular rallies. They even had nightly meetings to discuss strategy and updates from bargaining, which I think is really important. They fought back also, even though it was illegal for them to strike. And even though the union was being fined hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of this strike for being out on strike. So I'm wondering if you can explain how these kinds of courageous strike actions can be buttressed by an escalation strategy and to systematically build community support, which is necessary in order to force concessions from the bosses.
So firstly, solidarity with the Newton Teachers Association, the educators that were on strike there, with their community, with the parents that were supportive, guardians supportive, the students. It's inspiring to see, and it's important because education, as we've been talking about, public education is being attacked and dismantled. And so when there are struggles that pop up, we need to support them. We need to draw the lessons from what they're doing. And then we need to take those lessons and bring them into our own districts instead of accepting false choice cuts. So just solidarity with them. And that's extremely courageous of them to do. And it's necessary. And I think it makes myself and a lot of educators excited. As far as escalation strategy is concerned, so first of all, going on strike is number one. That was incredible that they did that. Our power as workers comes from our ability to withhold our labor and basically shut things down, right? And take a stand. So firstly, that's awesome. They should be absolutely doing that. But what's also important is not just going on strike, but what kind of strike? How powerful is your strike? How much does it actually shut down? and who else is involved in the strike. And so my understanding is that there was a lot of community support, a lot of parent support, which is excellent, especially at the beginning of the strike, but then it sort of waned. And I think what the union leadership could have done is mobilize those, community members in more meaningful ways to the picket lines, setting up, I don't know to the degree to which childcare or meal programs were set up, but those are the kinds of things that would need to be set up, I think, completely, so that, the community can keep functioning while we also make a point, take a stand. Another thing too is broadening out the strike, I think is super important. Not just keeping it to your own local, but calling on other educators to join you, maybe even just one day of action, a rally inside of whatever government official it makes sense, right? Something like that, or bringing other unions involved that aren't even educator unions, but a massive day of action, a massive parade, something along those lines. Again, it's not just a question of going on strike, but how much pressure are you putting on the establishment, where essentially you want to create a political crisis for them that they have to respond to.
And they're forced to concede to your demands.
And they're forced to concede to demands. And that's another thing too, just having really strong demands, like you had mentioned as well. That's necessary in a strike too. That happens sometimes in educator unions. Like I have seen sometimes the demands can be a bit abstract. But having concrete demands that really inspire people, a number when it comes to wages, whatever it is, 15%, 20%, whatever that number is, we have to be concrete, and that gets people involved. And it makes it more clear to the community what you're fighting for too.
So as we've mentioned, you're a member of Workers Strike Back yourself, Joe. Can you also briefly talk about Workers Strike Back activists on the picket line in Massachusetts who supported the Newton teacher strike?
Absolutely. From my understanding, there were 2 Workers Strike Back members that taught or worked in the district in some capacity, which is phenomenal. We need more Workers Strike Back members in all of our workplaces. But aside from that, there's a huge role to play for people who aren't, immediately involved in a workplace struggle to play in the struggle as Workers Strike Back members. And so members went to the picket lines to talk about that escalation strategy I was talking about, and not just we need to continue going on strike, not just the one day longer, one day stronger kind of strategy, you could call it, although it's a very weak strategy that oftentimes union leaderships put forward, but instead talk about what escalation means and how we can win these concrete demands. So Workers Strike Back members were there. They were super supportive of the workers, getting into great conversations, expressing solidarity, but then also not just passively doing that, but talking politics and talking about what's necessary.
Yeah, and I think everything that you're talking about in terms of what Workers Strike Back activists are bringing to these picket lines, the ideas, I think a lot of it is also an effort to help rebuild the militant labor movement that used to exist at one time in the United States. But we need those militant ideas. And as you were saying, Joe, earlier, young workers, rank and file union members, they're hungry for these ideas. And we're hoping that we can spread that even more so. And actually, related to all of this, related to the idea of militant labor action, as we know, in what will go down as a historic moment for the American labor movement.
Day 8, so many protesters, the fire marshal wouldn't let more in. Teachers tired of being 48th of the nation in pay.
The education workers of West Virginia walked out in February of 2018, setting in motion a national educators' revolt. The teachers were sick and tired, as you were saying about your own fellow union members, of low pay, disrespect, and the theft of resources from their students. After decades of decline in the power of unions, the teachers and the school support workers of West Virginia, they boldly staged a statewide, once again, illegal strike, shutting down the entire public K-12 education system for 8 days. And they won a wage increase for themselves and, as the teachers actually insisted, for not only for themselves, but all public sector workers in the school district, as well as defeating various threatened attacks. And this rebellion that began, educators' rebellion that began in West Virginia, then led to eruptions, as we know, in a number of other states, both red and blue, quote unquote, red and blue, Republican, Democrat dominated, including Oklahoma, Arizona, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Colorado, Washington State, Oregon, and California. Can you describe how this Red for Ed, as it came to be called, Red for Ed strike wave succeeded? And, again, talking about what are the strategy and tactics that they used, and specifically if you can touch on the role of rank and file leadership.
Sure. The rank and file of West Virginia, and then, spreading to other places as well, but specifically West Virginia teacher strike, which, as you mentioned, was completely inspiring, and I'm sure we'll continue to talk about that and its ramifications, was that the rank and file set up very systematic ways of organizing in their buildings before the strike took place. They had systematic ways of communicating with one another over the internet and other things as well. And also they got everybody involved in the community before the strike took place. So there was real meaningful preparation by the rank and file who had enough. And a lot of what they were talking about, West Virginia was and still is very, very poorly paid educators, even relative to, Washington and other places as well. But even still, a lot of what they said has resonated with me as an educator, where I've had to buy my own music textbooks for my classes, which is just, Jeff Bezos is in our backyard. Why am I paying for my 5th grade instrumental music textbooks? It's just ridiculous. But anyway, all that to say, the rank and file did a really excellent job of preparing for the strike beforehand. And another thing, too, that's super important about that, pointing out the rank and file, is that the union leadership initially didn't want them to go on strike. They weren't supportive of the strike. That's what we call a wildcat strike, when workers go on strike instead of, without the immediate approval of union leadership. Eventually, they had to support the strike because the force was just too strong and they were kind of blown along with it, right? But that's super important as well because, the establishment can tell us that certain tactics are illegal, like going on strike in a state like West Virginia or other states as well. But what matters the most is the strength that we have as workers, and that, we are being very deliberate in our actions as well.
And it's really about the balance of power then.
Yes. And I think, so 3 other quick lessons, because it really is so rich with them. And you mentioned 2 of them. One thing that made it so strong, speaking of the power, was that all 55 counties went on strike. There wasn't a single county in the state that sat it out. And that is really powerful. In addition to that, all the school staff struck together. So it wasn't just educators. This is crucial too. Bus drivers, custodians, social workers, office managers, cafeteria staff, everybody. And third, the educators, the community, everybody involved in the struggle organized lunches and breakfast programs for the students, which is a huge resource that public education provides to students. And
this is a poor state we're talking
yes,
about, very high poverty rate.
Exactly. It's a poor state, high poverty rate. These meals at school are essential. It's a matter of life and death. And those meals were extremely important in building solidarity between the community and the teachers, because then the Republican legislature couldn't divide them. They were united in this struggle, and we're still helping each other out in the process.
Right. So how did those strikes impact, future teacher struggles and also the labor movement as a whole?
Yes. So the Red for Ed strike was, I think, completely inspiring to really the working class in the United States. As far as educators go, I believe in the next year or two, 9 other states had really, really strong, meaningful educator strikes that I'm aware of. And in those states, it was multiple cities. So this went on to Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, LA, Oakland, Washington, other places as well. And I also think that it was, maybe another time we talk about CTU in 2012, because there's a lot of lessons.
The Chicago Teachers Union.
The Chicago Teachers Union in 2012. But Chicago Teachers Union and then the West Virginia strike and the Red for Ed, these were kind of the first moments that public educators took a meaningful stand in terms of struggle against the neoliberal attacks on unions and on public sector unions specifically. And so I think it was a moment where educators realized that they could fight back, that got students and the community excited about fully funding public schools or going on the offensive to tax the rich to fund public education, but also in an era of neoliberalism where I believe 2017 had been one of the years with the lowest amount of strikes in decades. So to have this moment for the working class was extremely inspiring. And, I was living in Boston in time. The Stop and Shop strike the grocery workers went on strike all across New England after that. There was GM workers went on strike after that. So it wasn't just the educator strike that set this off. And, there was other factors as well, but it was one of them. And it was a really big deal.
Yeah. And actually, to your point, it shows that struggles and victories are contagious,
build on each other.
They build on each other. Exactly.
And it was a really important victory. Like you mentioned earlier, the teachers in West Virginia, they won a 5% wage increase, not just for themselves, but for all public sector employees. That's massive. Mm-hmm. And it shows the power that the working class can have. I mean, imagine if it wasn't just the teachers, or all school staff, but it was other sectors as well fighting for higher wages and other workplace conditions. It would be incredible. And that's what we're fighting for.
Yeah, exactly. And one question that I think we need to think about is, in the context of this kind of worker and union fight back, what is the role of the Democrats been through all this? And can unions and rank and file union members trust the Democratic Party? I gotta know what your answer is going to be.
No, absolutely not. I think the Democratic Party, it's unfortunate. It's not good news. But the reality is, despite all of their nice sounding rhetoric, their actions show that they're not on the side of working people. They're not on the side of people going and doing their jobs every day, having families, whatever people want to do. They're not on our side. And instead, they protect the interests of big business. They have loads and loads of people funding their campaigns and the operations of their political party that are oil executives, that are people who want to privatize public education. They want to privatize public transportation. They want to attack any healthcare resources that we have available to us. So the Democratic Party really, they make deals really with a lot of, unfortunately, union leaderships, so that union leaderships then kind of hold back rank and file organizing, and they hold back struggle that challenges the status quo.
Right. And we saw an example of this recently by the Biden administration and the Democratic Party basically selling out the freight railroad workers unions and blocking their strike.
Shama, this reminds me of how in 2012 you ran against, for state legislature against Frank Chop, who is a Democrat, who...
The top Democrat for a long time, actually.
Yeah, who carried out, who basically gave Boeing the biggest tax cuts ever, and then proceeded to enact massive cuts on public education while giving more tax cuts to the wealthy.
I know, it's really, really shameful. And it shows you that while, as you were saying earlier, Bia, that Republicans and the right wing are openly and blatantly anti-union, and their agenda to privatize schools is very clear. Unfortunately, what we have is the Democratic Party also being deeply hostile to workers and the union movement as a whole.
Yeah. So, this discussion of the Democrats, and obviously there's a need to then fight back against this status quo. So how do working people and rank and file union members take on these union leaderships? You mentioned, unfortunately, a lot of them who are tied at the hip to the Democrats, and specifically in the presidential election this year. What side do you think unions should be taking?
Yeah, this is an extremely important question, and I agree with everything that was said as well in terms of Trump and the Republicans not being on the side of the working class, and then also Biden really just kicking working class people away as well. And the railroad strike is a really important example of this. I think that because so many union leaderships are tied to the Democratic Party, we can challenge that connection basically at the same time. So what I mean by that, for example, is one strategy that I think the labor movement needs to take up, I think all labor unions need to take up, is refusing to endorse Joe Biden in the next election. And also, of course, refusing to endorse Trump. But by refusing to endorse Joe Biden and by refusing to give any sort of financial contribution to Joe Biden as a resolution in your union, it automatically then pressures your union leadership to take a public stand on that position. Whatever stand they take, you have to adjust for, right? But I think one of the really, really important things about that is also the process. You put forward a resolution in your union and your union local. That's probably the easiest way to go about it at first, and get involved with Worker Strike Back, if you want to talk more about doing that. But that's one of the easiest ways to go about it first. And then through that process of talking to your coworkers about how we don't have to accept Joe Biden, we don't have to accept Donald Trump, we need to be fighting for other working class alternatives. Through that process, that's the beginning of rank and file organizing in your union. And so having those resolutions almost as a organizing tool, a vehicle, no endorsements, no money to the Democratic Party is a really important thing, because like we've said, they have the rhetoric, but their actions are not, they're not holding up to what they're saying. And so instead of endorsing Joe Biden or Donald Trump, we should, this is why Workers Strike Back is calling for a new party, a party that actually represents the interests of working people, that has no corporate influence whatsoever, a party that is basically an organism of working class struggle and a way for people to get involved. And I also think that right now, that's why we would say we're calling for a vote for Cornel West or Jill Stein. And yeah, we just cannot be. There's other points to be made too about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. They're warmongering parties, they're imperialist parties, and the working class, should no longer be supporting them.
Well, and it's shameful, right, that unions like the National Education Association, the NEA, gave one of the earliest endorsements they've ever given to a politician in the presidential election to Biden last year, giving him, a huge amount of money. And meanwhile, Democrats at the state level all across the country are carrying out massive cuts to public education.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, my union is a part of NEA, and
I used to be a member of the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers. Same story.
Same kind of thing. They immediately endorsed Joe Biden, and then also here at the local level, they are demanding that educators pay for a $6 million budget shortfall when, there are supermajorities of Democrats in the state legislature here that could be so easily doing something like, raising the capital gains tax or something like that.
And you're talking about $6 million? That's pocket change for corporations like Amazon and billionaires like Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, I'm sure we could look it up. I'd be interested to know how quickly Amazon makes $6 million profit.
I know, yeah.
Meanwhile, we have to go through all this massive struggle. But again, we go through this massive struggle and they force us to because it's a question of control. If we were to win money for public education, even a small amount of money through struggle, that shows to other workers in our area and other workers around the country, hey, we can fight for stuff. We can fight for more so that we do have these things fully funded. And both the Democratic Party as well as the billionaire class, they don't want any of that.
Right. And actually talking about educating ourselves as working people in order to carry out this fight back. We've talked about the Democratic Party and whether they're on our side or not, and also the role that the billionaires play and the connection, the nexus between the politicians of both parties and the billionaire class. All of this also brings up the other important question, which is of capitalism itself, the system itself. Do you believe that obviously fighting for and winning taxes on the wealthy, like the Amazon tax that we won, they're going to be hard fights because we'll have to go up against the whole power structure of the Democratic Party, the Republican establishment, and the billionaire class. But as hard as it will be for us to win those kinds of reforms, do you think, Joe, that will be enough? And if not, how does this struggle to actually have a decent public education system with high standards of living for everybody in the community, how does that link up with the question of capitalism itself?
Sure. It won't be enough, unfortunately, because as we've seen throughout capitalism's history, even taking an example as recent as Roe v. Wade, the working class can win gains and we fight for those gains. But the reality is, if we stay under capitalism, a system that puts profit over people, profit over the planet, those gains are going to be rolled back as much as possible. And we saw this with Roe v. Wade, and we have to continue to fight against that and defend, extend really abortion rights. Capitalism, because of this goes back, I think, to earlier questions we were talking about too. Why are they doing this to public education? Well, one of the reasons they're doing it is because they want to go after the unions. They want to go after the organized working class. Well, why are they doing that? It's because the working class under capitalism is the agent of change in society, and it's what makes everything run. So if you atomize the working class, if you pit workers against each other instead of allowing them to organize, you're effectively upholding the system. And so capitalism is very much at the root of attacking workers' rights, attacking worker organizing, again, the profit motive, that is what capitalism is. It's a big competition between corporations and, other entities for control and for money. And so I don't think that we'll ever truly have a completely wonderfully funded public education system with all resources that are absolutely possible given the amount of wealth in society. But I don't think it'll happen with this constant aggression from the capitalist class, which is why I'm a socialist.
It's been such a fantastic conversation about unions, the Democratic Party, capitalism itself. I wonder if before we let you go, because you're a music teacher, I can ask you a musical question.
I'm sure.
A lot of our viewers have said that they really appreciate the theme music of On Strike. And as we know, it's a cover of the Which Side Are You On song, which I hope, if you don't know, you should go and listen to that. Can you tell us a little bit about how you and your, I think, fellow musical teachers did this?
Yeah, it was a good friend of mine. Yeah, that's funny. Sorry.
Sorry.
So the question was, how did we go about it, basically?
Yeah, like how did it come about? And, maybe you can talk about the song itself, like Which Side Are You On?
Okay, sure. So the song, Which Side Are You On? It was written by a coal miner's wife, Florence Reese, in Kentucky in the 1930s. The lyrics were, I think the melody is actually an old hymn, but the lyrics are a song of struggle. Which side are you on? I mean, yeah, exactly. This points to this question of the reality of capitalism is that whether we like it or not, there are two sides. There's the side of the working class and there's the side of the capitalist class. And one of our roles, I think, as a socialist, but just as a member of Workers Strike Back as well, is to point those out. Not because we want to be like antagonistic or something like that, but that's the reality of the situation. And you have to have that mindset. I think you have to have that mindset as a worker and as a union member too, to understand things like class struggle unionism, to understand that our interests are not the same as the capitalist interests. And so we have to ask, which side are you on, right? And then we have to, from there, that's where our strategy comes. But as far as actually, writing the music, I was asked to write the music for this because, I was asked to write the music for the broadcast, and we had a number of conversations about what political songs would make sense and Which Side Are You On is politically clear and great, and it's a really good melody. So me and my friend Connor talked about how we could take this song and make it, not just make it more upbeat. We thought a rock thing would be good for an outro or an intro or whatever. And so we wrote the different parts and sent each other audio recordings of singing different things and basically just sent Logic files back and forth and figured out how to record it. And then at the end of it too, neither of us are great rock guitar players, but we have a friend Johnny who is. So I talked with him on the phone and sent him some sheet music that I had written up, and he wrote the music with the guitar. So he played the music with the guitar. Yeah.
Well, so Joe is a friend of the show then, since the beginning, helping out with this, with our theme music. So thank you so much, Joe, for being here today, for helping us with our Which Side Are You On cover, which I know many of our viewers enjoy. So we really appreciate it. And
yeah, I really agree with Bia. Yeah, this is great. And thanks so much, Joe, for giving us your time. And it was really a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to having more of these conversations for sure.
Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. On Strike is a production of Workers Strike Back, a nationwide organization fighting on working class demands like a $25 an hour minimum wage, union jobs, Medicare for all, and against discrimination and oppression. Workers Strike Back is also calling for a new party for working people because neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party represent us. Find out more at workersstrikeback.org and donate, and look for us on Patreon to support our work. On Strike is a broadcast entirely for working people and funded entirely by working people. Solidarity.